Thank you for coming. In 1920, the Russian engineer Vladimir Shukov designed a radio tower in Moscow. The project is an advocacy of unadulterated structural prowess, a will and a confidence to alter the face of the earth. The world will become other than it is, Shukov tells us, and structures like this one will make it so. We regularly define architecture as an ongoing reconception, not final answers, but perpetual possibilities. And that enduring reconception necessitates the enduring manipulation of building structure. Or does it? Guy Nordenson may tell us. Here's the generic structure interrogatory. What foundations, which floors, what walls, which roofs? Does the structure ratify the architecture, defer to the architecture, determine the architecture, or contest the architecture? Guy may offer an opinion. Structure is the expression of a sophisticated technical will, Shukov taught. Confound gravity, resist the wind, restrain the earth, support the accoutrements of every human endeavor. Confound, resist, restrain, support. And how does the architecture reveal that content? Is the structural discourse visually mandatory, or is the building structure the building's secret? Perhaps Guy knows. Why steel? Why concrete? Does physics determine structure? Is a thinner shell or a longer cantilever an advance on a thicker shell and a shorter cantilever? Is structure purely intellectual, or is structure finally emotive? Guy Nordenson will tell us. In 1920, a Russian engineer produced an icon for the 20th century. Does the Shukov Tower endure as a 21st century aspiration? Please welcome Guy Nordenson to SCI-Arc.
Thank you, Eric. It's really inspiring to be here. I've had the pleasure of teaching and lecturing and participating in the installation series a number of years ago, but just arriving here, being in the building, being among friends, had a great conversation with a student in the cafe about the Indian chief Standing Bear and his encounter with a little black alien that got me off on the right foot. So I want to, I guess, respond to part of what Eric said. The world will be other than it is, I think was the quote. And this is a talk which is going to be more about the way that is and how we can respond to it than it is about my practice as a structural engineer. So not so much about steel and concrete, but about a series of projects that I got involved in over the last 5 or 6 years, which have taken us and taken me in a direction that is tangential, but I think also related to the role of engineering and structural engineering in architecture. And that is a series of projects related to climate adaptation, and the way in which we can start to address the consequences of climate change in a productive and I think broad-based way. How we can deal with the way the world is changing. So I'm going to go through 6 different projects that are organized chronologically, and I'm offering them as a model of how designers can intervene, not just engineers. The teams that have done these projects are collective teams of engineers and scientists and architects and landscape architects, how we can intervene in this conversation to do with climate change and our adaptation to it. The first project was one I initiated with my wife, Catherine Sievit, about 6 years ago. We were asked to submit for a grant by our dean. Our dean commands, we obey. And he said we should submit for a grant from the AIA. And we came up with this project, which was to take this part of the New York region, the Upper Harbor, and look at it from a number of different perspectives, including adaptation to sea level rise, but also the possibility of turning it into a new kind of public space. I'd gotten interested in this place working on a project at the tip of one of those 2 piers. And even though I grew up in New York, I had never really identified this as a place in my mind. And so it was intriguing, I thought, to take this on as a new kind of place for the region. This was all post 9/11, so it also was implicated in the transformation of the region and its response to that event. So we took that zone between the red lines as our site. We took on the problem of flooding as a consequence of hurricanes and the fact that that flooding gets more severe and extensive because of sea level rise and what we could do about it. Sea level rise at the time was being predicted on the order of a foot to 3 feet. Kind of rule of thumb, I think, that we were using for the project and that's become more commonly accepted is that by the end of the century, we may be looking at about 1 meter or 3 feet at the outside of sea level rise. The response to storms in general for New York has been generally to propose a series of hard infrastructure interventions. These are barrier locations that were proposed at the time as a way to seal off the inner harbor and protect the city. It's still on the table as a proposition. The effect of these barriers would be to keep the water out, in some cases to probably flood the areas around the barrier, but at least protect the high-value real estate of Manhattan and Brooklyn. So basically it's the Dutch approach. Holland, after the 1952 flood, embarked on a very comprehensive program of protection for the lowlands of Holland, including levees, operable gates, and a whole system really going from border to border that protects the population and the cities in a very effective way, and they're now adapting that to sea level rise. So that would be one approach. And the alternative that we were putting on the table was what we were referring at the time as a kind of soft infrastructure approach, which involved a lot of different interventions along the coastline, roughening the edge, getting back to the typology of the old harbor with the piers, adapting that typology, but also adding islands, adding oyster reefs, adding all kinds of things that would have the effect of serving as wave attenuation, but also a kind of restoration project also for the harbor ecology, since it would change with the effect of sea level rise, and this was an approach to adapting to that. Along with those, we were also proposing that we would create a new kind of public space analogous to Central Park. When Central Park was created in the middle of the 19th century as an idea and then as a design by Olmsted and Vaux, it was a void within a void. It was a void that eventually defined the edge of that void, but at that time, this is from an early image of that, at that time it wasn't that explicit. And in a similar way, we thought about the St. Mark's Basin in Venice, which is a public space on the water, and we're proposing that we could sort of combine these ideas and make our new location that kind of new public space on the water. The on the water aspect of this was intentionally provocative. Ever since Westway in New York, there's been a strong opposition among environmental groups and also institutionally within the Department of Environmental Conservation at the state against any kind of intervention on the water. And we were saying this has to be reevaluated and reconsidered in light of climate change and sea level rise, that we have to consider a larger set of ecological questions that might override that opposition. Part of the research then that we embarked on after we got this grant from the AIA, the Latrobe grant, was a historical study of the edges over time. This is something that we repeated on several other projects that I'll show you tonight, as a way of starting to blur the edge and identify this need for thinking of the edge as a variable dynamic condition. We also surveyed the various conditions along that edge, soft, hard, and otherwise. Not surprisingly, there was no document of this available. Port Authority, nobody had ever done this kind of survey before. And if we were going to do any flood modeling, we really needed to understand that. But we were also, again, looking for a typology of edges, thinking, sort of in the spirit of Robert Smithson about how the interventions that we would have wouldn't necessarily be tidy, but would recapture some of that, the quality that was already there. We expanded that into an atlas that was included in the book that we eventually published, which went across the different locations and mapped the flood plains, both 100 and 500 year floodplains, and then the edge conditions. So working your way across the section there, you can see on the top, just basically identifying all the different conditions that existed there. Again, all toward the building of a model. This is the bathymetry, which is the landscape under the water, and then a combination of bathymetry and topography model, digital model, that would then allow us to do some simulations, fluid dynamic simulations of what our interventions might be able to do for us. This was a very basic step in this process, which again started to affect what we did on subsequent projects, which is to think of the landscape, the topography as a continuum, including the bathymetry and the topography as one. Again, a model that didn't exist before we were putting it together, but also a way of thinking about the landscape in a broad way. So we started to do some fluid dynamic studies to see whether we could identify the benefits of islands. We immediately ran up against some very significant limitations in the numerical models that are available in the scientific community. Lots of issues about how you model the wetting and drying problem of flood going on land. Lots of limitations we discovered in the way that flood simulations are done currently. So, as we were pushing the design, we were also discovering that we were pushing the envelope of what available tools there were in the scientific community. But this shows you with and without an island some of the fluid flows that we were trying to simulate. And then working with a graduate student at the time who's now a professor at Princeton, Ning Lin, she generated for us a synthetic hurricane. Well, actually, she used an existing hurricane, Isabel, moved it, and then recreated that hurricane and did a storm surge calculation for us, which showed, if you look at these two graphs on the right, showed that the amount of water, the storm surge that would come in, wouldn't be changed much by the intervention of islands, but that the velocity of the water, as you would expect, would be changed by that. A very, very simplistic study, but the beginning of an effort to make a proof of that hypothesis. In general, we would hope that some of these studies would also get tied into GIS calculations that would show us what the flooding meant in terms of the exposed population and built work. I did a project in the 90s which looked at the effect of earthquakes in New York and did calculations based within GIS, a program called HAZIS, that FEMA put together, which helped simulate what different earthquake scenarios would do to the city. This does the same thing for flooding. So there's a series of tools, from design propositions to simulations to GIS-based calculations, that would presumably begin to set up the consequences of these sorts of interventions that you see here. Some of these whimsical, we used to export our subway cars to create artificial reefs, keep them, use them, build windmills to serve as also storm barriers, and then create new islands, partly to create barrier islands for reduction in the wave effects, but also to replace the wetlands that are submerged as the sea level rise. So it can start to become a fairly complex set of interventions which serve multiple purposes as well in the process of adaptation. This is an image produced by Adam Urinsky's office for the book of what our approach would mean for Lower Manhattan, a design that they did in their office, starting with some geometric exercises and then leading through some water table experiments. We borrowed a water table from the University of Michigan, brought it over to Adam's office, and they did some studies of how flow would go. And what was very interesting about the process was that Adam and the architects that were on our team wanted very much for there to be numerical models that would allow us to interact with the design notions and the consequences of the design notions. The problem is that the science is nowhere near prepared to provide those tools. And so the only way we could do that was to sort of cobble together various approaches that would start to simulate what might someday be a more comprehensive approach, but at this point isn't anywhere near ready to do that. So these are not definitive models of what the flow would be, but they're an opportunity to look at what formal consequences might emerge from that. And then there's all the issues of the ecology and how the ecology on the coastline changes, which also needs to be studied. And then we played around with various kinds of transportation infrastructure, ferry lines. The mental map of the city is a map of access through public transportation, much like the mental map of Venice is the map you have in your mind about moving around on the Vaporettos, and whether you go around the outside or you bounce along the Grand Canal or you go on an express line. In your head you have these things and you think about how you're going to get from A to B by taking one of those paths. We tried to create a similar map which would create another version of what we were proposing, with express lines and lines that bounce back and forth and so on, using Venice as a model. And we published a book on that entire project called On the Water. The project then triggered a conversation with Barry Bergdahl, who eventually came up with the exhibition at MoMA called MoMA Rising Currents, which was a combination of workshop and exhibition, something new that Barry really invented around this project, which was very effective and successful. The process began with the research that we had done, so that kind of set the stage for what the project would be about. But it was also the notion that Barry came up with, that the teams that were selected would be put into a workshop situation at PS1 and would work there in studios that were provided for them for a period of 6 to 8 weeks, interacting with each other, but also interacting, and this is the part that I was very keen on, with public agencies and other groups, so that we could start that conversation and feedback mechanism with the public agencies that would be affected by this. And it worked out quite well. We had on the jury the Director of City Planning for New York and a number of other people who were, by having them on, by virtue of being on the jury, they were implicated in the project from the beginning. And then in the workshop, we were able to bring in lots of people from the Port Authority, from the state, from other communities that were affected by this. And it disseminated the ideas, and it also had an impact on the work of the teams. So this was the installation. There was actually an existing table there from another show that we reused carved out that little notch in there, and then displayed around the outside the 5 different projects that were included. So we drew this map and identified, kind of zooming into the next scale level, if you will, identified these 5 locations for the different teams, selected the 5 teams to work on it, and I'll just run through each of their propositions. There was one team of Adi Marinsky who had been involved in the original research with us. His office, Architecture Research Office, fielded a team together with Susanna Drake, looking at the lower Manhattan, so a different design than was published in our book, which was all about managing the water flows, both inward from storm surge, but also, interestingly, outward from sudden rainfalls. There's a big problem in New York that when we get sudden rainstorms, it overwhelms the sewage system, and so we end up dumping sewage with the rainwater into the bay. This was an effort to create this marginal zone which would help to process the rainwater in a more gradual manner, as well as bring the water in. And really, I think originally, with some originality, brought out this notion that you've really got to manage the flooding on the way in and manage the flooding on the way out, which is a lesson that was also learned in Japan after the tsunami. So looking at the old maps of New York, taking into account the fact that New York had expanded, that boundary is in fact mainland and wetland, taking that into consideration in their design. And then developing new types of streets that would be absorbent and manage, again, the water on its way in and on its way out. And then they had a number of diagrams that went with that. The second project was LTL, Paul Lewis and his partners, and they looked at number 1, which is Liberty Park, where Liberty Science Museum is, and took what is a very flat site and transformed it through a series of cut and fill operations to create a series of fingers that were then heavily programmed for all kinds of uses, research, leisure, and otherwise. But recapturing that typology of the piers, but in this case using the landscape to do that. Then they had lots of propositions for different ways, and a beautiful model that they created with overhead projection, which showed the variability of the water level in relationship to their proposal. Really quite mesmerizing thing to watch. Matthew Baird's team took the area around the Bayonne Pier and proposed, and this is the inundation potential, and they proposed a whole system of new land and glass reefs and a recapturing of the whole container area there, which there's a lot of old petroleum tanks that they would reuse in their proposal. And they did a lot of very beautiful models, sectional models, that were included in there. And also you can see there their proposal for these glass reefs that would be made from recycled glass. And architects had a notion of building a series of small islands along the edge and then linking those islands with inflatable barriers so that you could create a continuous kind of rough edge, but a rough edge that would actually serve as protection in the event of a flood. And they also had a lot of little inlets proposed to allow water to come in as well as bring the piers out into the water. And then Kate Orff's team in front of the Gowanus Canal and Red Hook area took the flatlands, the Bay Ridge Flats that are out here, where it's shallow water, and occupied them with oyster reefs, picking up the notion of the metaphor of the oyster as a cleansing device, which was also kind of a metaphor for the project as a whole, and making that also the program for their project as well. So building a kind of floating infrastructure on which the oyster beds would settle that would also create this barrier for storm surge, as well as changing the ecology. And then sort of very Brooklyn of her had lots of rituals and other forms of local activities built into her project, and a model that was built by a series of knitting circles working in cafes in Brooklyn. So it was a wholehearted affair. And the publication at the end of this book by MoMA, which includes all the projects and some essays about the projects by various authors. Quite a nice book. The effect of that project was pretty quickly felt even before Sandy. This is a publication of the New York City Planning Department, which took on this notion of the continuum of landscape and bathymetry, put it on the cover of their waterfront plan, which is a change. I mean, Amanda Burden said that we had changed the DNA of the city, unquote, and she started talking, in her words, of the water as the sixth borough of the city. So I think there was a clear shift that happened among some of the policymakers in New York as a result of the project, and then they started to use these projects as an example of what could be in the future for the city, which put a certain imprimatur on the notion that maybe going out into the water was a good thing. We were invited by Jonathan Solomon to show this project of Palisade Bay on the water at the Venice Biennale, and this was at the same time as the MoMA show was happening, so we thought maybe we should do something that kind of diverged a little bit from that, and worked with colleagues at Louisiana State University on a project for the Mississippi, which would be exhibited in parallel to our New York project. This is a notion that was created by a coastal engineer named Robert Twilley, who was at LSU, who has been advocating for a number of years a new program for creating wetlands or reestablishing wetlands in the Delta based on a new redirection of the Mississippi that would carry sediments in in occasional floods out to make new land. And so we identify these 5 different locations using the Olympic colors here to highlight them, and Wax Lake, Terrebonne, Bayou Lafourche, Davis Pond, Bayou La Loutre, each representing a new diversion of floodwaters from the Mississippi or the Atchafalaya that would build land. As you probably know, a great deal of wetland and land is being lost, not just because of sea level rise, but because the way that Mississippi is channeled, all the sediment that comes down ends up dumped off the continental shelf pretty much at the end of the Mississippi, of the Birdfoot there. So the normal course of flooding and sediment transport that had built the delta in the first place hasn't been able to happen because of the control of the river. Historically, the river moved around. It moved. This is a map that was made in the 19th century showing all the different courses of the Mississippi River in geologic time. Clearly, since the 19th century Army Corps work on controlling the river, that hasn't happened anymore. The lobes that exist in the delta were all created by former courses of the river going back millennia, and they still exist as bayous currently. So the Army Corps' management of the river was well known, organized among the districts that each are there initially to control the course of the river, now also to manage the floodplain since the 1927 flood. There's a great book called Rising Tides, which I recommend to you if you're interested in this topic, which is all about the 1927 flood and the consequences of it. It's quite remarkable. If you think about Herbert Hoover got famous because he was put in charge by Coolidge, President Coolidge. He was put in charge of the management of the post-flood recovery, and his success in doing that got him the attention that eventually got him the presidency. The same way as Helmut Schmidt in Germany, by managing the flood in Hamburg, was propelled to become the head of the German government. So there's a lot of political consequences. In the case of the 27 flood, there were also very important consequences in the civil rights movement that resulted. So the story is quite interesting and complex. And one of the things that came out of it was the uncontrolled failure of the levees and the uncontrolled flooding that occurred, which convinced everybody that you just simply cannot control the river. You've got to create spillways and other ways to relieve the pressure in the event of a flood. This was on the levees. The only place left for people to take refuge was on the levees. And one of the things that came out of this, one of the sad consequences of the 27 flood was the invention of the word concentration camp, which emerged because there was an effort which Hoover condoned to keep the sharecroppers, black sharecroppers, from leaving the area and going north, which they basically all wanted to do, having lost everything. Keep them there, keep them concentrated on camps, on the levees, so that they wouldn't leave and deplete the labor pool for all the plantation owners. So lots and lots of layers of complex social as well as engineering and planning issues around this. The consequence of it was a mandate from Congress that the river would be managed in the future, keeping a certain amount of water going into the Mississippi and pushing a certain amount of water in Atchafalaya Basin. Now, it turns out the river really wants to go over to the Atchafalaya. It has wanted to do that for several centuries, and so the flood control is really about, the flood management system, or the water management system, is really about keeping the water in the Mississippi for the navigation and keeping it from shifting over the Atchafalaya. And so you have here the diagram, the classic diagram from the Army Corps that shows where the water is meant to go in the event of various flood events. This is the Old River Control structure, which keeps water from all going to the Atchafalaya, moving parts of it over to the Mississippi. So our project was, in that context, a redefinition, which would require an act of Congress, of where that water would go in the event of floods, in order to build land with the sediment transported in that water. So this was on the far west side, the Wax Lake intervention, which is actually in place now and has been building land over years by diverting sediment out and creating that form that you see there on the right down that channel. So all we're saying is more of that would occur through this intervention. Similarly in Terrebonne, going down the Atchafalaya and then down the intercoastal waterway and then through a new channel that we would create. Same over here, Davis Pond and Bayou-le-Loutre over there, going actually down the old Mr. Go canal, which was a source of so much trouble at Katrina, repurposing that to move sediment in that direction. And essentially, our proposition was new plumbing for the Mississippi. In the event of the maximum annual flow, about 1.2 million cubic feet per second, a portion that right now the congressional mandate is 30% goes in the Atchafalaya, 70% goes in the Mississippi. Maintaining that, but then specifying where it goes into these 5 diversions, and then where there's twice as much water coming down, starting to move more of it into the Atchafalaya, and then in the event of a design flood, 3 million cubic feet per second, which is comparable to the 2011 flood and the 1927 flood, more and more of that sediment and water. And these are pulses that happen in these floods where it's all about really taking advantage of that brief moment where there's so much sediment coming down that you can really have a huge impact by using it to build land. I was told by friends in Louisiana that if I ever showed these diagrams down there, I would be shot because the implications of all this stuff is serious for a lot of people. What we're trying to do is stir up the conversation and get some of these things on the table and really visualize the ideas that Bob Twilley had suggested. So in the exhibit at MoMA, at the Venice Biennale, we did these 2 models to illustrate the topography and identify the manifest of water as a solid floating above that. So first looking at the Mississippi, this is a 5-foot square model with an exaggerated scale for the vertical, so a different scale, vertical and horizontal, so that you start to see the texture of the land, and then in the water part of the model showing these diversions, and also showing the depth of the river, which is extraordinary. That the river is so deep relative to the landscape around it. This is the Mississippi, which we represented with these glass dowels. So that's the model of the delta, amazing plateau that you get there on the east side of the Mississippi. And then for New York, the same model idea. This is the model being made at Princeton. We had about 4 weeks to make all this stuff for the Biennale, painted gray. So the Manhattan is on the bottom there. You can see the Bayonne piers. Where the hands are up there is Staten Island and the Verrazano Narrows. And then the water represented in layers, including the green showing sea level rise and flood layers. And it was puzzling for people, but I think after a while, people sort of were crouching down, looking inside, learning, thinking about what it was that we were showing them. And Jonathan Solomon published through his 30-60-90 series a catalog of that exhibition. And then more recently, we did a similar project for the Yangtze River. Princeton held a conference last January, and so we took the opportunity to propose a project along the same lines for the Shanghai region, and also identify the methodology that we were starting to develop, that basically starting with the history and geography, looking at this notion of controlled flooding, which is Bob Twilley's idea that instead of flood control, to think about controlled flooding, accepting the fact that the water is going to come in and understanding how to manage that. And then always taking the design and trying to verify it through simulation, either experimental or numerical. So this site for this was the whole Delta region, Hangzhou at the bottom, Shanghai up there, and the Yangtze River coming in, which of course is one of the great rivers of the world and brings a huge amount of sediment and deposition, and has been the site of many, many floods over many millennia. This is the flood map for the Pudong area. We were concentrating mainly on the Pudong Peninsula. There's Shanghai up there on the river, which is of course built on highland. And again, worrying about hurricanes and understanding how those will affect Shanghai with sea level rise. There's a great story we discovered about a Emperor Yu, who was a civil engineer in a way. He was very famous for having figured out how to manage the flood control system for the Yangtze River, and he did it by using a soft approach with canals, with barriers that were modest but layered, and various other measures that allowed also a managed drainage process of the floodwaters as they came in. This was some of the levee structures that he developed that have been rebuilt for exhibit purpose. We studied, you can go back in history and look at the maps and see how the peninsula has grown over time. This is from the early part of the 20th century, a really good map that we were able to use for bathymetry modeling out in the water as well. Again, the mapping of the changing edge conditions over time. And then, in this case, the proposition was, this is a model that Catherine Sievert built and some tests that she did, looking at how we would think more in terms of the drainage process. We were working with a fluid dynamicist named Howard Stone who brought up really the same question that ARO had brought up in their Rising Currents show. what do you do about draining the water out in a managed and controlled way? And so Catherine's idea was to have these open polders built that would serve, and you see them out at the edge there, that would serve as open detention basins that would capture the water and then let it drain out gravitationally over a longer period of time without creating too much damage, but would also begin to create topography and landscape and character for this area that's otherwise really flat and featureless. One of the inspirations for this are the cheniers, which are these ridges that grow with the advancing coastline from the effect of waves coming in and building up ridges and also piling up seashells and other things along the edge. So you can see the sort of progression that happens over time as you get both sedimentation layers building up, but then also these layers of harder material coming in with the ocean waves as well. So trying to use that as well as a beginning of the sort of topography that we were looking at. We also worked through an atlas along the edge, again trying to understand how the edge existed and what had been built. Now, this is a way more defined and engineered edge than the edge of the Upper Harbor of New York. There's been a tremendous amount of work done by the Chinese government in building a whole system of levees and layered levees in order to make land as well as protect the coastline. The airport is out there, and so if you ever fly into Shanghai, you'll see all these structures as you come in to land. So moving around and cataloging what edge conditions and flooding situations we had to deal with. So all these projects, not including the Yangtze projects, but all these projects had been building up a certain awareness in the city, getting some attention over time, but then after Sandy, it really all exploded. There was a lot of press and interest in this soft infrastructure approach that came up, almost too much so. One of the lessons of Sandy was, I think, an important one that maybe hasn't gotten enough attention, which is that we really hadn't gotten the predictions right. And I think one of the issues that I've realized in the last year or so is that we have a really poor process by which we estimate the flood risks around the country as compared to the way in which we manage earthquake hazards. It's way behind. And I've been trying to push for some of the lessons learned from the development of earthquake hazards mapping and regulations so that it could start to affect the FEMA's approach to flooding. But for example, this superimposes the Sandy surge event and the 100-year flood maps in gray. Way more flooding than was predicted by the 100-year maps. It's not clear whether this was a 100-year storm or not, but when you think about it, the structure of the insurance program, the structure of the flood system is you're in a zone where you're in the flood zone, you have to worry about it, buy insurance, protect yourself, and so on. The minute you're out of the zone, you can forget about it. And that structure, or if you're behind protection, and if you're in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, because there is protection, you don't have to provide any protection for your house, or you don't have to provide any protection or buy any insurance. What's called residual risk, which is risk that is a consequence of failure in any kind of flood control structure, is explicitly excluded in the reauthorization of the insurance program by Congress a couple years ago. So it's as if you were to say that certain parts of LA were just simply outside earthquake hazard because, I don't know, because it was built on rock or because it was on a site or something like that. And you could go from one block to the next, go from protection to no protection based on some map, which you can't actually validate very well because it's all being developed through various subcontracts to companies that keep the process proprietary. So there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed, and I think came up as a result of the surprises of Sandy. This is the history of hurricanes in New York, not including Sandy. Sandy's storm surge was about 3.5 meters, so much higher than anything that had happened before, potentially meaning that this was really a very low probability event. And if you want, there's a really nice NOVA show that was just aired last week that you can see online about Hurricane Sandy. And it does point to the fact that there were lots of converging factors around this storm that made it extremely exceptional. But in any event, the flooding was very extensive, and the consequence afterwards was a real kind of crystallization of this notion that there were these two approaches that could be taken. There was the hard infrastructure approach that all the engineers were, and big engineering companies were championing, and then there was this other approach that had become adopted into the discourse of soft infrastructure. And it really began to find its way into all the various publications. This was a commission that Cuomo set up immediately after Sandy, which worked over Christmas and produced a report, quite a good report actually. You can get it online if you look at NYS2100, which included our project as an example of, in fact, most of the people, there was this subcommittee of the group that put this thing together, which was on land use, and there was the Nature Conservancy, the Army Corps, various other people, and everyone was saying, we got to do soft infrastructure, we've got to do natural barriers, we've got to do this, we've got to the point where I was getting slightly fed up, and I started to become the champion of big, hard infrastructure, because nobody else would. But really became, I think, a bit of a almost excessively strong consensus, but nevertheless clearly shows the impact of the work that we had done. There was also reconsideration of a panel that I'm part of called the New York City Panel on Climate Change of what the hazard was that we needed to prepare, and these are a couple of pages from that. This document is also available online. If you go and just look at New York City Panel on Climate Change, you'll see it. And this was a reanalysis that we did actually starting beginning of this year, so it was very fast-paced, but very rigorous analysis that looked again at what we were dealing with in terms of sea level rise. This was from the earlier projections, and then this was the new projections that we had done over there. And then gradual recognition that we had to start to think not only of the effect of sea level rise on the hurricanes, but also the effect of the changing temperature of the seawater and other climate changes on the generation of hurricanes. And there's a really interesting methodology that's been developed by Kerry Emanuel, who's a professor at MIT, of generating synthetic hurricanes that are based on a sound climate models, the kinds that are used for climate change predictions, and using those to start to generate new estimates of the probability of hurricane, the changes in hurricanes with time. Again, the NOVA program that was aired last week did a really nice job of explaining this. In effect, what seems to be the consensus is that with warming of the planet, with the increased moisture in the atmosphere, what we're going to see is potentially a reduction in the number of moderate hurricanes and an increase in the number of extreme hurricanes over time. And in some, this is sort of on a global scale, and then in some places like the North Atlantic, actually an increase across the board in the number of hurricanes. So it's affecting different parts of the planet in different ways. For China, for example, there may be a reduction in the number of hurricanes. For the North Atlantic, there may be an increase. So it's more than just, the old hurricanes off a higher platform. It's also a new kind of a regime that has to be considered. And my colleague Ning Lin, who had worked with us on the earlier project simulating that hurricane, she's been starting to do these simulations with Kerry Emanuel, looking at the relationship of the flood height with return period, and then the shift that happens with the change in the climate. And these are using different climate models. What these initials stand for are the different standard models that that are being used. But in other words, here the 500-year event becomes the 50-year event, or the 100-year event. Well, actually, in that case, but here the 100-year event becomes the 20-year event. The other thing that this does, which is really important, is it starts to orient us around more than just a single event, the 100-year flood, more toward a continuum. And I think the strategy that we need to develop, is really the same as you have here in California, which is performance-based design, which says there's a range of possible events that we have to plan for, and there's a range of possible performances that we can match to those events, and we need to design in such a way that we have designed that range, not just a singular response to a singular event. Another consequence of Sandy was this amazing document, which I strongly recommend you have a look at if you're interested in this stuff, that Bloomberg's team put together called the S Irr Report. It's a 428-page thing filled with ideas really that have never before been in one place about building resilience for the city across the board, not just coastal, but also in terms of housing, in terms of telecommunications and otherwise. Similar in a way to the governor's report, but much more comprehensive. It's interesting government styles. The governor put this commission together, about 30 people, a tenth of which actually, or maybe a third of which actually did any work, who wrote this thing over the Christmas holiday, and then it was done. It had to be done in time for his State of the State speech. Bloomberg organized an army of government employees that were all put to work, about 80 people who put this document together with input from the outside, but very much a government effort as opposed to a commission approach. But lots of really good stuff in there. Again, taking on board all these ideas of different typologies of coastal protection, offshore constructions that would help in different ways. So coming up with a very broad, rich collection of strategies that were incorporated. This is the map of all the different ideas that were incorporated in this book. So, not one barrier, but 257 different proposals happening in different places that would have benefits. So islands off the edge of Breezy Point that would help to protect Jamaica Bay, potentially a barrier for Jamaica Bay, all kinds of offshore structures in front of Staten Island. This is a project that we're actually working on, which I was able to convince them to put them into the book, which is building some islands with dredge material for the Port Authority of New York, and so on and so forth. There's lots of great ideas embedded in this. And a kind of Roosevelt approach of, just throw out hundreds of ideas and see what catches on, not just in terms of effectiveness, but also in terms of adoption by various agencies that are responsible for doing all this. So it goes on through, this is the Rockaways area, all these different propositions that are incorporated in that, or for Lower Manhattan, including in Lower Manhattan an idea for a new, which wasn't very popular, but a version of Battery Park City along this edge of Lower Manhattan, which is now being studied by, hopefully it'll look better than this, but it's now being studied by the city. There's amazing frenzy of stuff being done now by the city, including this report, but then also follow-up on this report, as if we were facing the end of the world on the 31st of December. So there's going to be a lot of really good material and a lot of really good reports and propositions coming out even in the next couple of weeks. The last thing I want to show you is a new project that we're embarking on now. We were given a quite large grant by the Rockefeller Foundation to do a project we call New Directions in Coastal Resilient Design Strategies. And it's basically the rising currents writ large. The Army Corps has been directed by Congress to come up with a comprehensive study for the North Atlantic in response to Sandy. And they have to report in January of 2015 on what should be done in this region of affected areas. So from Philadelphia, actually from the Virginia coast all the way up to Massachusetts. And Rockefeller came to me and asked what sort of a project. Well, actually, it started at the Army Corps went to Rockefeller Foundation because the Rockefeller Foundation had managed the governor's NYS2100 study and done a very good job in managing it. So Rockefeller, Army Corps went to them and said, could you help us figure out how we could do some unconventional things in addition to the things that we would normally do in a situation like this? And they came and asked, Rockefeller then came and asked what we might propose, and I suggested, so this is some of the projects that they have currently on the books. I suggested that we identify 4 different locations up and down the coast and get designs done for these locations, but designs that would be very much targeted to work for the Army Corps. Unlike the designs that were in the MoMA show, these really have to be digestible, if you will, by the Army Corps of Engineers. So we've put together 4 different teams from Harvard, City College of New York, Princeton, and Penn, 3 of which have landscape departments, actually the only 3 landscape departments on the East Coast, plus Princeton, and each of them has been given a site. This is Hampton Bays, Norfolk, which the Penn team is working on. This is up north, Narragansett Bay and Providence, which the Harvard team is working on. This is the area around Newark, which the Princeton team is working on, and then the Jamaica Bay area for City College. These are the projects in Jamaica Bay, for example, that the Army Corps has on the books right now. And so what we would be doing is starting up with a larger scale and then zooming down to, say, this location and designing a more sophisticated approach to the construction, perhaps, of some sort of temporary barrier or some other interventions in a subset of that site. And these are some of the early studies that, looking at old maps, trying to understand the history of this site over time and see how that can inform the new design. One of the things we started talking about just recently is, we tend to focus on everything that's above the water and building and changing and transforming that. But what also needs to be designed is the topography under the water in a way that is beneficial across the board. And this is actually something that a lot of people have also been talking about around Venice, is that what that bathymetry is determines much of how it performs and behaves ecologically, but also in a storm. So looking back at those profiles and how they've evolved over time is a very important part of the research. And then this is actually an early Army Corps map showing a barrier here, which is where the city actually got their idea for potentially putting a barrier here. And then also all the beach restoration work, which is now going. So this is all stuff that was planned 30 years ago, which has finally been funded post-Sandy, which is happening right now as well. So those are a kind of history. There's a lot going on in New York right now, pushed by all the funding that's coming in from the federal government, some through the city, some through federal agencies, some through the state. And hopefully, I think some of these things will get built and will be a good example for other places around the world. Thank you.